Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to our first breakout session on housing for Alexandria's future workforce. I'm Helen McIlvaine. I'm the city's director of housing, and I am thrilled today to bring you a really interesting panel to provide some diverse perspectives about how housing is impacting the city's ability to compete for economic development, as well as issues about how other communities have handled issues related to gentrification and redevelopment, as well as some of the fears in our own community about what we might expect with the Amazon HQ2 and Virginia Tech Innovation Campus. So first, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Landrum, who's the president and CEO of the Alexandria Economic Development Partnership. She leads efforts to market the city to businesses who would be interested in working here. And she was she led, along with Arlington County, the very successful effort to get HQ2 here, followed by the Virginia Tech Innovation Campus. Stephanie also leads the way in terms of regional collaboration. This was the first time our jurisdictions had participated jointly, and obviously to a very good result. But she recently also was critical to the foundation of the Northern Virginia Economic Development Association. And again, because realizing that people who are attracted here are coming for potentially all of the great things that Northern Virginia has to offer. So Stephanie, I'll ask you to come up and give us some context, and then we'll follow with other panel members. And we hope to have time for questions and answers at the end. And I wanted to again remind you that all of the materials will be posted on our website after today.
Thank you, Helen. Good afternoon, everyone. It's exciting to be here. One of the things that my office, my team, my colleagues, and I have worked on over the last few years was really deliberately tying economic development and housing affordability and availability together. And so obviously being invited to speak at a housing summit shows that we're successfully doing that. So I'm going to just go through a couple of slides to tell you a little bit about how we maybe successfully made that connection. As Helen mentioned, let's see. Okay, there we go. As Helen mentioned, we worked on a little project a few years ago that was the Amazon RFP. As it turned out, 238 other communities also decided that was an interesting opportunity and wanted to go after it. And those 238 jurisdictions ranged from Canada all the way down to Mexico. The majority were in the U.S., but it was probably the most competitive economic development pursuit in the history of pursuits. And it was because it really had the opportunity to be a catalyst for so many things in a variety of communities. And so in places where there is no industry per se, they tried their hardest to pitch to Amazon, as much as places like here in the Washington, D.C. market, where we have a really strong and healthy economy, but we also have room and desire to grow. And so when we, everything right, what is it called? Sofa, quarterback, when you're the whatever, after the game and you get to look back with 2020 vision. In retrospect, when we look back on the Amazon RFP, the thing that really stood out, the deciding factor for them was the availability of the labor force. And so for us, we had to think a lot about who was here, who fit the sort of jobs that Amazon wants to hire, and that is what led to us proposing the Virginia Tech Innovation Campus so that we could actually create more smart technology workers. But when you start thinking about a pipeline, the very next thing that you have to think about is where will those people live? Because if they can't live here, they're not going to school here, and they're not going to work here. And so as we were putting together our response to Amazon, we very much focused on providing a solution and showing the company that we actually had solutions and ideas about how to continue to tackle housing affordability and availability. And so just as a quick primer for those of you not familiar with National Landing, I can talk to you offline about whether or not you like National Landing. I know it's a real hot button issue, but National Landing is really just the collection of 3 districts that we all know as Pentagon City, Crystal City, and Potomac Yard. And those 3 districts very deliberately have been planned by Arlington and Alexandria over the last few decades to be connected, both physically through trails and transportation, but also in the way that we develop and the type type of companies we're sort of going after to fill them out. And so we thought as we were communicating to Amazon, we needed to not call them 3 different names. We needed one name to refer to it as, and that's where National Landing came from. We also were very lucky to have landed these 2 catalysts on either end of the district so that the impacts from their investments will actually be felt throughout. So Amazon is building their headquarters at the north end up in Pentagon City, and then Virginia Tech is building their campus at the south end in Potomac Yard. And what you will see then in between is pretty significant new investments at both the state and local level in transportation, housing, and higher education to make sure that this district can operate as a cohesive unit. I won't read through this, but I just wanted to point out these were sort of what we called our win themes, why Northern Virginia, why National Landing ended up being the winner. And for our discussions here today, I really wanted to point out this third one, a global and inclusive region that enables the seamless movement of people and ideas. Amazon itself is really focused on diversity and inclusion, and it was something that we spent a lot of time communicating to the company about our beliefs here at the local levels, both in Alexandria and Arlington. And inclusivity has everything to do from policies and laws and the way that we treat our residents, but also how much we invest in and prioritize the creation and protection of affordable housing. And so this was something we spent a lot of time talking to the company about. Whenever I have the chance to talk to an audience, I want to make sure people understand how the project is going to play out over 15 years. Many people, when they heard that Amazon chose us, were very scared that all of a sudden 25,000 people would be moving into Northern Virginia in 2020. The reality is this project is going to ramp up over 15 years. And so at the end of 2019, there were 400 people who Amazon had hired working out of Crystal City. None of us could point them out. You don't see people walking around with Amazon t-shirts in Crystal City kind of overwhelming the streets yet. So what you will see, though, is that you can see that their ramp is over the 12 years to get to 25,000, and then those last few years they can get up to 37,850, I think is the number. The same is true with Virginia Tech. There's exactly one person who works for the Virginia Tech Innovation Campus who is headquartered in Alexandria so far. So the ramp is slow and deliberate and is allowing us as communities and as a state to make these investments so that we are fully prepared to take advantage of these catalysts. So the tech campus, this is very general. This is their version of that last slide. They're still in this first year of planning. Their first buildings for the campus, they hope to break ground on later this year after approvals in the March timeframe. The building will actually take 2 to 5 years, and then to scale it to its ultimate $2 billion or $1 billion impact will really take more than 10 years. One of the really interesting things about the Virginia Tech campus that we were excited about is when I work with companies and we talk about them making an investment in the city, we're usually talking about 15 years. Another large project I worked on was the National Science Foundation, which moved into the Eisenhower corridor. They signed a 15-year lease. It was a huge, fantastic deal for Alexandria, but think about the difference between talking to somebody about making a 15-year commitment versus making a 100-year commitment and what that does for us in terms of planning and investment together. So the last thing I'll mention that is obviously really important here for this audience is these are the figures, the investments that Alexandria, Arlington, and the state are making as part of the Amazon investment package. Arlington committed to an annual investment of up to $7 million. This was before, so these numbers have only grown. Alexandria, $8 million, and really the most important piece, I think, for us was the Virginia Housing Development Authority created a new fund mechanism to invest directly in National Landing and the surrounding areas for the first few years of this project. And as I said, it was really the first time that economic development and housing affordability were tied together. We are hopeful that this will be the new model moving forward. We're excited, and I'm sure some people will talk about some of the first expenditures of these funds, but we're going to feel those positive impacts directly in Alexandria and Arlington as a result of the state's investment. And that is all. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Stephanie. So next up is Brian Allen Jackson, A.J. Jackson, to those of us who know him well. So A.J. is the Executive Vice President of Social Impact Investing for JBG Smith, and he's leading their Washington Housing Initiative and managing their impact pool, which is an investment vehicle to facilitate private capital coming in for affordable housing. So something totally new that they hope others will choose to replicate. You may recognize AJ because before being with JBG Smith, he was a partner at EYA and worked extensively with our housing authority, with ARHA, to redevelop some of their communities and transform them into very successful mixed-income communities. So he knows affordable housing and he knows Alexandria, and I'm glad to work with him in his new role. AJ.
Thank you, Helen. Good afternoon, and thanks for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Washington Housing Initiative, which is the effort that Helen mentioned we've launched at JBG Smith to try to bring private capital into this space of housing affordability. But picking up on what Stephanie said, there's an increasing recognition, and this came out in the HQ2 process, but it's come out in other areas in the business community, of the importance of housing affordability to economic growth, and the link between the ability to grow businesses and the well-functioning housing market that provides affordability up and down the income spectrum. So we see this as not just something that's important for the region to continue to grow, but really an essential relative to the region's position in competition with other areas across the country that are facing similar issues, where businesses and the public sector are coming together to try to address this issue of housing affordability. In DC, as the largest private real estate owner in the market, we started thinking about this issue probably 5 or 6 years ago, and came to the conclusion that there was a way that we thought we could be additive using our scale, but also some of our unique abilities to be additive to trying to address the issue of housing affordability in the Washington region. For us, that became the Washington Housing Initiative. The Washington Housing Initiative is something that we launched about 2 years ago in partnership with the Federal City Council, which is a local civic organization, and at its core, it has 2 components. It has a nonprofit component called the Washington Housing Conservancy. That's a nonprofit affordable housing provider. And then it has something that I run inside of our company, JBG Smith, called the Impact Pool, which is an investment vehicle that provides financing. And we provide financing to the Conservancy, but also to other nonprofit and mission-aligned for-profit owners who want to go out and acquire and preserve affordable housing across the region. Our goals with the Housing Initiative really focused on being able to move at the speed of the market, being able to bring private capital at scale. So most of the capital in this is private investor capital. There's some JBG Smith investment as well. And being able to build a model that could be replicated. So we want others to copy what we're doing in this market and also in other markets, so that we can actually have a meaningful impact on housing affordability. That's really what this is about for us. Our focus in the Washington Housing Initiative is what we call the missing middle, but it's really a group that earns too much for traditional housing subsidy and too little to afford the cost of rent in our market, as well as the other expenses of life like childcare and healthcare. And so there's great need at the lower end. Absolutely. There's also a great need for public support at the lower end, and there's a lot of market activity at the upper end. But what we saw very clearly in the market is that there was also need in the middle, and there really haven't been to date significant programs or money available to help folks in that middle band. In dollar terms, we think about that as kind of $50,000 to $100,000 in income. From sort of housing policy terms, you can think about it as kind of 60 to 120% of AMI. But however you want to think about it, it's really, again, that group that's not making enough to afford the average rent in our region. So that's really where we focused with the Housing Initiative, trying to address a space where there wasn't a lot of other activity. We also focused on preservation. The Urban Institute, who was instrumental in working with the local council of governments in setting the housing goals for the region that were recently adopted, has talked a lot about the need for preservation. And the simple way that I like to think about it is, we need to build more housing in the region, but we have a hole at the bottom of the bag. And so no matter how quickly you fill the bag from the top, if you don't plug the hole at the bottom, you're not going to solve the problem. And so preservation was an area where, again, there wasn't a lot of focus on preserving what we call naturally affordable housing, but housing that's not in any program, doesn't have any subsidy or protection on it just because of its location and its age, perhaps. Its rents are naturally affordable to that group that I talked about. So that's really been our focus in the housing initiative, is trying to preserve that housing. In Arlington and Alexandria, I deliberately put the jurisdictions together because people move across them and work in one and live in the other, and vice versa. There are about 27,000 units of that type of housing in the market today. And over the last 15, 20 years or so, about 90% of what was naturally affordable in Arlington County, which has great statistics on this, has been lost. So it's been lost to either being demolished and something else being built there, or being lost to being renovated and having the rents raised to the point that it's no longer affordable for that group. At the same time, the average two-bedroom rent in Arlington has gone up by about 90%. So I think that helps to illustrate the importance of preservation along with production. Production is very important, but again, our focus on preservation in this workforce ban. The third component of what we focus on in the housing initiative is what we call high-impact locations. And what that really means is we want to preserve housing in places that produce great outcomes for the people that live there. So there's a whole host of social science research that we can talk about later around the impact of location on outcomes, particularly for children. And our objective is not to preserve affordability just in places that are cheap, because they're not good places to live, but to preserve affordability in places that are producing good outcomes for people. And so there's a lot of data that we look at in analyzing particular opportunities to see if they fit into that criteria. But those are really pillars of what we're trying to do in the housing initiative. I'm actually not going to talk about this. I'll come back to this later in the specific example that I'll talk about here. So we've raised a little over $100 million on the impact pool side from a whole host of institutional investors, and one of our goals going in was to raise significant amounts of institutional capital, because that's how you move the needle. We thought that if you could not bring private capital at scale in a model that was replicable, then you could never really move the needle in terms of housing affordability. And so our hope is that by raising this amount of money, deploying it in this way, that it will encourage others to come into the space and replicate what we're doing, and we can have a significant impact on housing affordability over the long run. I'll talk about this specific example at a high level because it's in the process of closing right now. But this is a project that we're working on with the city. The city council talked about it a few weeks ago, where we're bringing our impact pool capital, which is sort of that light green piece there, into the capital stack along with the city's money, other public dollars such as the VHDA funds that were mentioned earlier, and a private mortgage to allow the city through a nonprofit to acquire about 325 units of housing in the city of Alexandria and keep them affordable. What's remarkable about this transaction is it's a project that was marketed for sale publicly, where the nonprofit had to move at the speed of the market over the course of about a week and a half to make an offer, secure the property, and buy it. That's exactly what we're trying to do with the housing initiative, is provide capital that can move that quickly to go out and put properties under contract that the transaction will occur. The high-level takeaway for me from this is that for about $25,000 a unit in local taxpayer funding, you get nonprofit control of 326 units of housing. You immediately create 245 units of committed affordable housing in the city of Alexandria in the course of 60 days, as opposed to back when I was in the development world, about 5 years. And I think that's really remarkable, and that's something that can be replicated again and again, and can have a meaningful impact at plugging the hole at the bottom of the bag in terms of housing affordability. So I'll stop there, and we can, I guess, pick up the rest of the Q&A.
And I just want to add to AJ's remarks that the city is pleased to have this opportunity to preserve housing. various levels of housing are going to be created there, affordable workforce and market rate housing. So our strategy ensures that no residents currently will be displaced, of course. So next, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. George Leventhal, who is the Director of Community Health for the Washington, D.C. and Suburban Maryland areas for Kaiser Permanente and this region. He has been leading their public health promotion and community benefit programs, as well as their philanthropy efforts. Which connect, sorry about this, can't read my own handwriting, unfortunately. And of course, most of you know who are interested in housing that the connection between health and housing stability has been, or health and housing stability has been well documented in recent years. Before joining Kaiser Permanente, Dr. Leventhal served 16 years on the Montgomery County Council and was elected 4 times and served as council president twice. He served on the council's Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee and led important initiatives to establish community clinics that provide health care for 70,000 uninsured persons, to house military veterans who are experiencing homelessness, as well as efforts to house those who have been chronically homeless. Today, he will also share his work to mitigate the efforts or the impacts of the Purple Line development and concerns about gentrification. So, Dr. Leventhal.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here in the city of Alexandria. This will be a case study that is primarily in your neighboring state of suburban Maryland. Although Kaiser Permanente in the Mid-Atlantic region has a very significant footprint in Northern Virginia, and as my experience deepens with the company, I'm the lead on housing and homelessness in the entire Mid-Atlantic region, and I'm looking forward to making new friendships and relationships here in Northern Virginia, but this presentation is not about Northern Virginia. So, of course, why is it increasingly in the field that health systems and hospitals are looking at affordable housing as a key part of our mission to address the social determinants of health? Average life expectancy for a person without stable housing, I've heard different estimates, but for this slide I picked the biggest, which is 27.3 years less than the average housing person. There's a variety of studies in the field. They all show the same thing, that if you are unsheltered, if you're exposed to the elements, if you don't have a stable place to live, you're not going to live as long. And I chose this graphic. I did this slide myself, the second graphic, because I've frequently explained, if you want to understand why it is so important for health purposes that patients are stably housed. If you have a patient who has to be medication compliant, you can't expect that patient to take his or her medications daily if they don't have a medicine cabinet to keep them in. And so the solution to homelessness is housing, and Kaiser Permanente nationally and locally has made homelessness and the production and preservation of affordable housing primary focuses of our philanthropic efforts, and that was a very happy thing for me because it occurred just after I lost my last election in Montgomery County, and I was in the job market marketing myself as a specialist in low-income housing and homelessness. So we look at our role, and this is part of the reason why hospitals and health systems nationally are being strongly encouraged to address housing supply in their service areas as an anchor institution. We're a major employer in all 8 of our regions, but unlike some other major employers, we can't pick up our jobs and move them elsewhere, move them overseas. We serve patients and members right here in Alexandria, in the Mid-Atlantic region, and so we're an anchor institution. We see the direct connection between the health and prosperity and ability to thrive of our members and patients in the region, as it directly affects our bottom line and our mission. So we're trying to fulfill that role as an anchor institution rooted in place here in the Mid-Atlantic region. And we're trying to address the real threat of gentrification and displacement. There was a study at the University of Minnesota very recently that showed that over the last 2 decades, Washington, D.C. suffered the most widespread low-income displacement of any major central city. Our region, as AJ just pointed out, needs to increase its stock of low-cost housing. The Urban Institute, AJ already cited it, a very influential study about what local governments and the private sector and the philanthropic sector have got to address. The Washington, D.C. region needs 374,000 new housing units by 2030 to meet growing demand. Of those, 264,000 need to be low-cost housing. And so the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments has adopted very strong targets. Local governments, including City of Alexandria, are being strongly encouraged to adopt their own aggressive plans to meet this need for production and preservation of affordable housing. And so communities located along the route of the new Purple Line light rail transportation system in Montgomery and Prince George's counties may face an especially high risk of gentrification and displacement. When we look at what's occurred in Washington, D.C. over the last few decades, we see that a lot of the displacement has occurred adjacent to transit stations like Shaw, like Columbia Heights. And so as we build this as we make this major investment in infrastructure, which will have a transformative effect on communities along its route, a transformative effect on the University of Maryland and the ability of researchers and students and faculty to get around without having to drive a car. It's going to be a very positive thing for the region, but of course, as the region becomes more accessible and easier to get around, rents are likely to rise, it becomes more desirable. And so the Purple Line Corridor Coalition was founded at the University of Maryland, bringing together the two counties and community leaders and advocates to seek to improve the ability of those who have already lived in the Purple Line Corridor to reap the benefits of the new transportation system and not be forced to leave because the place where they live suddenly becomes so desirable. And so we've been on the steering committee of the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, and because of the strength of the Purple Line Corridor Coalition effort, we were selected to anchor an affordable housing initiative in the Purple Line Corridor by a national think tank called the Center for Community Investment. And it's called the Accelerating Investments for Healthy Communities Initiative, designed to help participating hospitals and health systems deepen their investment in affordable housing and advance policies and practices that foster equitable housing solutions. We're one of 6 hospitals and health systems around the United States. Others are in Baltimore, Cincinnati, Boston, San Bernardino, and Columbus, Ohio, and Pittsburgh. That's 7, but Bon Secours is in both Baltimore and Cincinnati. And what we do, we get together, we meet in locations around the United States, and the staff, because it's a housing accelerator, the staff of the Center for Community Investment talks to the 6 teams, and they raise their voice and they say, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. That's a joke. But in seeking to accelerate the production and preservation of affordable housing, we've convened a lot of very successful meetings of community residents, government officials, nonprofit and for-profit housing developers, bankers, lenders, CDFIs, community development experts, to really get into the weeds of where there are potential developable properties, where there are multifamily housing projects that may be turning over, that are coming up for sale, where the counties can exercise their right of first refusal rights. We try to assemble visionary leaders like AJ to raise private capital, and in a way it's like speed dating. You identify the site, you've got an investor, you've got a development practitioner, and you hope the magic happens. And we've been very successful in accelerating a batch of production and preservation projects. And what we also have done is we have commissioned, with the $375,000 available from Center for Community Investment, we are conducting an inventory of land opportunities in the Purple Line Corridor. That would be land that is publicly owned, land that is owned by mission-driven, not-for-profit organizations, e.g. churches, and land that is underutilized, commercial space that may be low-rise with a lot of parking that could be transformed into mixed-use residential, retail, and commercial. The Purple Line Corridor is attracting a lot more attention. JP Morgan Chase has just made available $5 million for lending in the corridor, and we just found out this week that the Center for Community Investment is going to make available to us, over and above the $375,000 in grant funding, $1.5 million in impact investing, which Kaiser Permanente will have to match, but we are seeking to assemble an available pool of investment capital for production and preservation. And so the projected outcome is 1,000 homes in our batch, either new production or preservation opportunities this year, and by 2030, the goal is no net loss of the 17,000 housing units along the Purple Line corridor that are currently affordable to residents at 60% or less of area median income. Just very briefly, I'll talk about our efforts on homelessness. We're working with the national consulting organization Community Solutions in many of our communities across the United States that are adopting evidence-based best practices to reduce the prevalence of homelessness, working subpopulation by subpopulation, starting with veterans, working on the chronically homeless population, working on homeless families with children. My company just made a $200,000 grant to Montgomery County and a $175,000 grant to Arlington County to address the different subpopulations that they are closest to housing. In Montgomery County, it's families with children. In Arlington County, it's the chronically homeless. But Washington, D.C. is the epicenter of the homelessness crisis in our region. This is homeless per 10,000 population, and I put Alameda County, California, for comparison because Kaiser Permanente is headquartered there, and we all know that about 1/5 of all homeless people in the United States reside in the state of California. It's an absolute crisis, and yet the prevalence of homelessness per 10,000 population in the District of Columbia is worse than that. Seattle, New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., those are the 4 cities that are facing the biggest homelessness crisis. And so I have the honor and the challenge of working with the District of Columbia government, with Community Solutions and nonprofit service providers to develop a strategy where our philanthropy can make the most difference in addressing the homelessness catastrophe in the District of Columbia. And finally, we have invested, our national company has invested $50 million in impact investment funds in a revolving loan fund called the Prescription Home Fund. It's a $100 million fund, $50 million of Kaiser Permanente's impact investing funds, $50 million from the Enterprise Community Loan Fund. It's available in all 8 regions, Kaiser Permanente regions throughout the United States. We have closed 4 projects in our Mid-Atlantic region, 2 in Baltimore City, 2 in Washington, D.C., and illustrated here is a great example, Pedestal Gardens in Baltimore, which was at the end of its useful life. It's being modernized, it's being brought up to speed, and permanently maintained below market, affordable for, in this case, very low-income elderly. But of the 4 projects that we've closed on with loan funds, they address the needs of very low-income, formerly incarcerated, and formerly homeless residents. So these are high-risk, very complicated projects to finance. Thank you very much. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, and we will have questions afterwards, so please be thinking ahead. Thanks. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Evelin Urrutia, who is Executive Director of Tenants and Workers United, located in the Alexandria area of the city, but with a much broader impact across our city, Arlington, and this region. So Evelin began her work at Tenant and Workers, leading efforts to empower youth. And you might not believe this, but until Evelin began to raise the need for it, there was not bilingual counseling services at our own high school, T.C. Williams. So as a result of her efforts, there are now bilingual counseling services and staff. There are also individual career and academic plans for kids in ACPS who need that and need that career guidance. She also organized a program called Community Organizing and Education for Democracy, co-ed, to encourage youth to travel and contribute through their career choices and their educational choices. So Evelin has been leading work to assess the potential impacts of a national landing on the Alexandria community. She has been doing work and studies related to what is happening with rents there, the community's concerns, and we've asked her today to talk to us. Tenant and Workers, you might remember, really changed the city's approach in the Beauregard area by coming to public meetings and speaking for people and showing us that people at lower incomes were really struggling with housing. We had assumed since the property was market affordable, that probably there were lots of people at about 60% living there. And instead, because they insisted we look at it, we discovered that there were people who were much closer overall to 40%, and they were spending about 60 and 70 and sometimes even more of their income and foregoing other things, or they were sharing housing resources. So today we're asking her to share her experience and expertise and insights as she and we as the city work to make sure that all benefit through the Mount Vernon Avenue corridor plan. So thank you, Evelyn.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Evelin. I am the Executive Director of Tenants and Workers United. Our organization has been around for more than 30 years. Our organization started trying to stop the evictions of our community 30 years ago. And thanks to that fight, now we had a housing co-op in Alexandria, Chiricahua, which is the community that I'm going to be talking about today. It is really important when we highlight the good things that Amazon and Virginia Tech is going to bring to us to also highlight that struggle, the challenges that it's bringing, right? It's good, but it's not good for everyone. There are some people in this community who really have been living here for more than 30 years that we cannot just say they don't exist. We have to include them in the part of the process. We have to ensure that they had a voice and also to hear their concern. Our organization, after the announcement of Amazon and Virginia Tech, we took a look about the community that we served. And we passed a survey in the Alexandria community that, for the ones who are not familiar about the Alexandria community, is probably 10 minutes away from here. We are a boundary with Arlington. It's in North Delray. It's close to Delray. And we passed a survey to around 2,500 apartments. We're really focusing on trying to get 10% of those apartments and find out what our people were going through, what were their expectations with the arrival of Amazon, and what were their concerns. Just to talk a little bit about Alexandria. Alexandria is really rich on culture. We have around 42% of the families are from El Salvador, 22% are from Honduras and Guatemala. So as you know, we had Central America in Alexandria, basically. We try for the economy with attempted restaurants and also small businesses, own businesses, that operate by selling or providing service to the community that live in. We had a strong sense of community because people know each other, they share their language, they share the story. It's a unique community here in Alexandria. This is not a transit community. This is a community that have come here and have stayed here. An average is 12 years and a half that these people stay in it, but when you walk through the community the way we do it on a daily basis, you find people who have been living here for more than 30 years. 60%, this is one of the biggest concerns, and when we talk about housing, right, when we talk about affordability, when we talk about to be affordable for the community, we cannot ignore that we do have a bigger needs than just the 60% of the median income. If you see 67% of the people that we surveyed, 30% of them, are at the 30 or lower of the median income. And 28% are at the 40 or lower of the median income. So what this is saying is that we have a unique community that is really stable, that have been in the city for so long, but is already struggling to survive. And we have to be honest, with the arrival of Amazon, those 25,000 new employees, whether they come today or they come 5 years from now, they will have an impact on this community that have not been redeveloped. It's a community that is unique. You walk through it, and you will see the unique what I'm talking about. So proposed for housing for 60% or above, that's not going to be serving our community, the community that we already have. And just to connect it to a point of our survey, it was interesting that there was an article coming out in the cassette, and the Alexandria cassette, I think it was back on December, right? That it showed how some of communities in Alexandria, what they earn on the median income, and this is what we have for Alexandria. is basically 50% or less than that. So what I'm talking today about it, even though I'm pointing about our survey, is a reality that is up there. This is some of the recommendations that we have. We have been working for so long on housing. We have been raising our concern. I think we are one of the organizations that sometimes I feel like probably the city is tired of us, of hearing from us, that we are there talking about the needs of the community, and we're talking about the people that usually are not sitting on the table taking decisions, or they don't have the time to come to meetings because they have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to survive. So some of the recommendations that we have are clearly straightforward, and I know that from the speech in the morning, they also make some recommendations similar to this, right? So this is not new to all of you, but we're talking about ensure to preserve the community. But if there is redevelopment or new housing coming aboard, let's be sure that at least 30% of the new housing is for the people who already live there. We believed, not just only as an organization, our members believe that when we talk about higher income and we are not thinking about the community that is there, that's called gentrification, because we're gonna be displacing the community that we have to add a different community to it. So that's my presentation, and thank you so much for listening to it. That's the reality.
Thanks, Evelyn. And first, I wanted to see if we have members in the audience who would like to ask questions. We have a microphone, and we welcome you to come up.
I'd like to ask this of most of you, but specifically Mr. Rosenthal. I've lived in Alexandria and Los Angeles. I can tell you, I just left Los Angeles last fall, and the difficulties there with dealing with affordable housing and housing for homeless are just like nowhere else in the country. But how are you trying to deal with the fact of the pushback of this NIMBY group that you're going to have anywhere you go, especially with gentrification? The amount of money that we agreed to pay in extra taxes in Los Angeles would fund so much of trying to get the approximately 56,000 people off of the sidewalks and streets of Los Angeles County. But every time that the mayor and the council members and the neighborhood councils would try to get approval from people in certain areas, it was, no, 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 don't put transitional here. You're going to hurt my investment where I bought my condominium or my apartment. And all of the development we're seeing is very high end with, massive amounts of apartments that have gyms, concierge services, all this type of thing. How are you dealing with this, and where are you getting this? I'm confused. Do you have in place in certain areas of the metropolitan district that these nonprofits or the government does have a right of first refusal of properties coming up? Because does that exist in Alexandria? If it does, I'm surprised.
Well, I would just say it does not exist
Okay.
in Alexandria. It is something we are exploring as a potential tool, not because we can require it, but because we would potentially incentivize it, which means we might pay for that right of first refusal. So thank you, and I'm going to let
Okay,
Dr.
thank you.
Leventhal answer.
I'm grateful. Is this on? No. Is it on now? Yeah. No? Someone else is on?
We want to,
I think maybe turn that off. I think I'm the only one who's supposed to have my light on. Is that better? Can you hear me?
why don't you come on up here?
Well, I think all four of us could speak at length on the topic of NIMBYism. As I mentioned, for 16 years, I was a local elected official. I had to run for re-election every 4 years, and NIMBYism was an enormous concern for me, and happily, I'm no longer an elected official, and it's something that elected officials have to worry about. We want to incorporate community engagement in our housing accelerator effort in the Purple Line Corridor, but it isn't so easy to do. The constituents in Arlandria, for example, are not as likely to show up at a public hearing because they may be working at night, or they may not feel safe testifying in the halls of a government building. And so what often occurs is that the process for gathering input that elected officials use tends to favor those who are the most resistant to change and have the most at stake in maintaining the status quo. And that's a fundamental problem, and what local governments need to be thinking about is how to do a better job of gathering input and engaging communities rather than just holding a public hearing and wait to see who shows up, because the folks who show up tend to be retired, they've got time, and they, as I say, tend to be very vested in the status quo. I think that Prince George's County has a different attitude towards economic development and attracting new residents than Montgomery County does. The traffic in Montgomery County is worse, the schools are more overcrowded, the county overall is more affluent, and so you know, my perception as a longtime student of local politics is that NIMBYism is a gigantic issue in Montgomery County, and in Prince George's County, the attitude is somewhat different. I will also tell you that we are going to sponsor in Montgomery County, which is taking up its revision of its general plan, a series of workshops to discuss the history of redlining and segregation and how that contributed to the zoning map in Montgomery County, which is very exclusive, you know, and zoning everywhere. I mean, let's be very clear about it. Racism and segregation are integral to zoning. They are connected root and branch. And so as communities look at a revision of their general plan, and I'm looking at my friends in the planning departments here and a couple of our suburban governments, it is important to look at opportunities to allow multifamily housing in what was previously single-family zones. These are going to be very controversial proposals, but it's the only way we can move, especially adjacent to transit. Land is at such a premium, and when you look at what's occurred in California, where you know, just vast acreage devoted to single-family housing in areas where you know, the price of that limited stock of single-family housing is just insane. I get to travel to California quite a bit now because my company's headquartered there. And we don't want the kind of crisis, and it's closely connected to NIMBYism, as you say, that has occurred in Los Angeles, in the Bay Area, in San Diego, to happen here. We've got to take a more enlightened approach, but we've got to do it through community engagement and through reports like the Urban Institute study that help to educate the public that we've got a real crisis happening here. So it's not a simple topic, but since I'm not an elected official anymore, it's not as much of a headache as it used to be for me.
Do we have another question? Please come on up.
My experience more than offset the alleged advantages that the NIMBYs have. I have yet to see them prevail here in Alexandria. Countervailing it is the special interests and their piles of money to bring about a desired outcome. The question that I have for the panelists, perhaps the Business Association would be the best one to